hi Greg. Firstly, I'd like to say thanks for coming down and playing for us tonight. I'm certainly looking forward to your set later, and I'm sure the same can be said for everyone else in the room behind the camera. I'm going to ask you a few questions if that's all right. Right, first up is that you started DJing, I read on your Wikipedia page, at the age of 15.
I did, yeah.
Did you have a fake ID?
No, I mean, it was a bit tricky because I was like kind of DJing and then going to school and like putting on my school uniform and going, and I had to hide it as well because I was like terrified that the school would find out and stop me doing it. And eventually the club where I was working did find out, but it turned out that I could still work there provided I didn't have alcohol. And then they kind of let that go as well. So it was, I mean, I also started working in another club before I was 16 as well. So by the time I was 16, I think I was doing about 4 or 5 nights a week. Because that's how it worked back then. You used to, it wasn't like now where you just like did a gig at the weekend or you travelled about. You just were a resident in a club. And back in those days, like the licensing laws meant that all the pubs were closed at 10:30. So like the clubs were the place that people would go afterwards, and so clubs were open all through the week. So I sometimes end up working like 7 nights a week and stuff.
Do you find it to be a bit of an intimidating environment when you were so young? Because like clubs nowadays, at least I don't know about back then, but they can be quite rough places. It can be quite a difficult environment to be in.
Well, I mean, I lived in a pub for a period of time between the ages of 7 and 13, and so I suppose that in a sense I was kind of used to that environment anyway. Yeah, it was odd. Now I think about it, you know, I mean, I never had a teenage life. I mean, years later I kind of look back and I almost like, you know, I thought, wonder what it'd been like to have gone to college or, you know, have that lifestyle like a lot of people do, because I just went into an adult's world in a sense. Like, I mean, it was a nightclub, it wasn't just a discotheque. You know, I was working in, you know, like in places with a wide range of, I mean, the room I worked in was for like the younger crowd.
The Wigan Pier, is it?
No, this is way before that. I was still in my hometown, which is a place called New Brighton near Liverpool, and it was like, just like the clubs that were there in you know, I just developed my own little scene and built from there. It was later that I ended up at Wigan and then went to Manchester and worked at Legend and then the Hacienda. So that was kind of 5 years on from that. But, you know, like 1980 I went to Wigan.
Fair enough. My next question is about the Hacienda. Was the Hacienda all it's cracked up to be now, or is it do you think it's been a bit romanticised over the course of time?
Yes and no. I mean, when I was there, which was 83, it was still a club trying to find its feet. It was, they'd opened it with the best intentions. They, you know, like people like Rob Gretton, who was New Order's manager, Mike Pickering, who was in a band called Quando Quango, but later became the DJ. He was the booker, the promotions manager for the Hacienda. Tony Wilson, those people had all been to New York because of New Order and a certain ratio, and Quando Quango played there. And they'd seen all the clubs like Paradise Garage, the Roxy, you know, the Loft. The big one that they always went on about was a place called Danceteria. That was the one that they wanted the Hacienda and the music policy and everything to be based upon. But it wasn't right at the time, you know, like, you know, just the conditions were right. The crowds were too separate. I worked in Legend, which was a predominantly black crowd, and they wanted to attract that crowd across. They had a mainly student indie type crowd, but not enough people were going at the time, and most of the time it was just like this big empty kind of chasm, you know, like a huge kind of club with not enough people, cold, and we had a few really good nights there, but generally it was a struggle, and they had membership problems. I mean, it wouldn't have survived as a club but for the fact that New Order had a hit with Blue Monday. It was all New Orders, like, I don't know if you've seen Peter Hook's, but Hacienda had not to run a club. Well, it was all New Order's money being pumped in to keep it going, and that's the period that I was there. But in a sense, it was about like planting seeds, you know, like for the future, and they eventually brought in all these different kind of factions, and then with the advent of house, they already had like a big night in the mid 80s. I was there in 83, so by 86 they had a really successful Friday night there that was running. But in 88, when Ecstasy came on the scene, it just exploded it, you know, it just went through the roof, and it was the right club at in the right city at the right time, and at that point, you know, all this hyperbole about it, you know, it's justified, because, you know, going in there, I remember like being in there in like 88, 89, and just the unity. I've never seen, I mean, I always tell this story about I was stood in one of the alcoves with like a mate of mine, this guy called Kermit, who used to be in a band called Black Grave, and we were there. I think he played here one night, and we were there one night, and he was talking to me, and everyone was like eared up, and there was a track playing in the background, which was FPI Project, which was Rich in Paradise, based around, well, going back to, it was almost a cover, going back to my roots, the old Lamont Dozier, Richie Havens track, and there's this piano breakdown, and as I'm stood talking to him, just in conversation, his hand moved in the air, and he's just carrying on talking, and I looked around the alcove, and everyone was there saluting this moment, and I remember looking outside into the wider club, and it was so complete. I'd seen unity on a dance floor before, but not everything, and that's what it was. You know, it was like a beautiful moment. It couldn't last forever. It went sour quite quickly, because with the drugs, it brought in the undesirable element. The gang side came in. It's like the wolves moved in on the sheep, took over the drug trade, then took over like parts of the club. The alcove wanted to take over the door. They had to close the club down. So it suffered for that, but it had that golden moment, and you know, that's why we're still talking about it all these years on, because not many places have that, you know, and to that level, that intensity, and that's what it was there.
Fantastic. Moving on then, a lot of my friends, they don't listen to your music, they perceive you as a disco artist.
Okay. But
earlier in your career, you're more well known for your electric cuts.
Yeah, I mean, disco's just been the name that's been put on this side of the scene that I'm involved with, and in a way, I mean, I accept it now completely. And disco, in its original term, if you go back into the 70s, before it was a set-aside genre, it was the music that was played in clubs and discotheques, which was predominantly soul and funk.
Okay.
So, whereas now the music I play kind of spans a whole spectrum. It's like funk, soul, disco, kind of indie dance, you know, house. There's a whole spectrum of music, but it's been narrowed down to disco as a term for it. So, you know, that's it. You get stuck with these terms, you know. I mean, we didn't ask for it, but you know, as I say, in that original context, it works fine.
So do you feel it's unfair to sort of pigeonhole your music in that respect then?
Well, no, I mean, what I do really, you know, when it boils down to it, is I'm drawing from the past, but trying to do it in a contemporary sense with the re-edits, and also, you know, artists now who are again influenced by that period of time, who are making new music that kind of harks back to that. So, no, I mean, it's fair enough in one respect, but it's a much wider remit than that. I mean, where you feel it mostly though is in the States, and it took, you know, in the States, sadly, disco's still almost like a dirty word. It was so put down. I mean, you know, what happened in America was that in '79, you know, disco absolutely dominated the chart. I mean, something like, in that year, I think for something like 8 months, the #1 in the American charts was a disco record. It was huge, absolutely massive, and all the radio stations were changing to a disco format. But you know, there was a backlash against that, and there was this guy in Chicago called Steve Dahl who worked for. He was like a shock jock for a radio station, and he got into this thing of, you know, smashing disco records on air. But it ended up with this Comiskey Park Stadium in Chicago, where they basically had this ritualistic record burning that was completely homophobic and racist, and it actually succeeded in turning a lot of people within the industry against disco. And by the end of '79, disco was pretty much declared dead, and radio stations again were switching back to a rock format. When MTV came into play just in the early 80s, there were no black artists, for example. It was only when Michael Jackson, a few years later, you know, was doing, you know, videos they couldn't ignore. They took on that, and so it was a terrible thing that happened in American culture. And even today, when I go and tour there and across the country, there's still people that look down on it as a term. It's almost like it was thrown in the cultural dustbin and, you know, spat on really, and that's a real sadness, because I think America, in many respects, it's lost. Because, as I say, people don't understand. I think people look back to the 70s and they think punk was massive, and as influential as punk was, it was small in comparison, you know, like to what disco was selling and how influential it was across the board. But you know, this backlash managed to actually drive it back underground. I mean, good things came of it going back underground again, and there were reasons why, I suppose, that there was the backlash, because everyone was jumping on the disco bandwagon. I mean, Rod Stewart was doing his disco, even Ethel Merman, you know, like everyone thought they could do disco, and so it became a bit cheesy on one end of it. But as I say, you know, like culturally, America has lost, you know, riches, you know, because if you look back to that period of time as well, you know, like some of the great musicianship, the South Soul Orchestra and the Philadelphia people, you know, these were like, you know, blues and classical and jazz people, you know, these were top musicians that were playing this, but it was kind of, you know, at the end of it, they just made it into that it meant nothing. It was a throwaway music, but it never was. And so the fact that it's come back around in a sense, and with America at the moment, there's this like whole kind of explosion of EDM, electronic dance music, and on one level, you know, yeah, it's a common denominator thing, but I think that's going to draw a lot more people back into the history and what went on and the culture and everything, and hopefully they'll rediscover. It's the same happened with the blues, that America discarded the blues, and it took like the British invasion in the early, like the Beatles and, you know, the Stones and the Yardbirds and everything, to come back and start talking about all these blues artists, and they were, hang on a second, you know, and they went back and found them and realised, you know, and it's their heritage, you know, and it's just like disco is the heritage of the people today, you know, and dance music from that period. And that's what YouTube, I suppose, does. It allows people to access it and the internet and everything.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's been definitely recently in the UK, there's been definitely a huge resurgence. I mean, I've seen it working.
Yeah.
There's a huge resurgence of disco music, where lots of like young kids really getting into it. So maybe in the States we'll see something similar.
Yeah, I mean, the States is really behind what's happening in Europe. I mean, it's strange to say, but it, you know, a long way behind because of that. It's like say house music, which has been like a staple of dance culture since like the late 80s or the mid 80s even here. It's never, you know, it's never been a big thing in America. Hip hop was everything. Hip hop took it all.
There's not much house in America.
No, I mean, it's always underground and always has been. But now, as I say, this EDM thing all of a sudden has become this juggernaut. And you know, I saw a documentary the other day that was online, and it was like some DJs that 2 years ago were maybe playing to 50 people, who all of a sudden now are in front of 10,000. You know, it's like the late 80s was here, that all of a sudden it's exploded, and you know, I think there'll be positive benefits from that. There'll be some of those people that get into the music that way, but then start to kind of dig a little bit deeper and realise what went before, you know. And with the re-edit scene, I mean, that's the trick, because that enables older music to be presented in a new way, but respectfully. Yeah. You know, not kind of bastardised and kind of ruined, you know, just put a straight kind of banging house beat.
Put a dunk on it.
But yeah, put a dunk on it, exactly. But you know, like approached in a respectful way, but given the bottom end that people are used to now in like a club environment.
Fair enough. So for a period of about just under 20 years, if I'm right, you left DJing to pursue a career in production.
Yep.
What prompted you to do that?
Well, I mean, back then it was a different environment. I mean, the DJs weren't travelling, you know, I mean, I never played in London. I played once in London, right near the end, you know, in '83, and that was as part of the Hacienda tour. It didn't work in those ways. The North and the South were separate. You know, I did I mean, you know, I was very successful then on the scene I was involved in, but the furthest I ever got was Birmingham or Nottingham or these places. That was exotic, you know, like to kind of get there. So it was a different environment, and I felt I'd gone as far as I could go. I mean, Legend, the club I worked at, was a Wednesday night in Manchester. It was, as I said, it was a black crowd. It was packed every week. It was the latest music coming out of New York. It was everything I'd wanted.
That's really exciting.
It was as far as I could go. So it's like with the Hacienda, even though I worked at the Hacienda towards the end of my time, and I worked at the Hacienda because of what they'd seen me doing at Legend. And people now would say, oh wow, you worked at the Hacienda, that must have been amazing. And it's like, Legend was the club. That was amazing, that was where it was at. And so, in that sense, I'd achieved everything I'd set out to do. There wasn't, as I say, going abroad, working overseas, everything that followed.
So you felt like you got a new horizon?
Yeah, I didn't, you know, I felt that I needed a new challenge, and what I'd started doing was editing. I started doing radio mixes for Piccadilly Radio, playing like, again, this latest American kind of electro funk, the new stuff that was coming out. And that got me into a more slowed down kind of production mind of working with music and wanting to kind of approach that direction. I also managed a breakdance which Kermit was in called Broken Glass, who got pretty famous. They did like national TV and everything from Manchester, and you know, that was at the time when breakdance just went massive and everyone was like interested in it. And so I came out, I did an album within about 6 months of stopping DJing. I had an album in the charts, got to number 60, everything was going well, and then it just like went Pete Tong, absolutely, you know, everything went pear-shaped, and I just found myself kind of stranded really, and I ended up moving to London and trying to find my feet there. Eventually I managed Ruthless Rapper again, Kermit again, it was his crew, and we did 2 albums for EMI. It was an up and down period, you know. Back then, if you're involved in recording, the trick, you had to find a studio, and that costs money. Yeah. So you're always hustling to kind of get in. It wasn't like now where you could just work at your laptop and get your ideas down. And so you're always beholden to people or record companies and trying to get deals and everything. And you know, so sometimes it was good, sometimes it wasn't so good. And by the mid-90s, I'd kind of hit the wall with it. And it took a little while. I mean, kind of lost my mojo for a time, and you know, just became disconnected from everything. I wasn't going to clubs or anything at all. Had no interest in coming back into DJing or anything. And you know, I think bit by bit, you know, I just got dragged kicking and screaming into the modern world with computers. You know, I held off for as long as I could. I kept away from mobile phones and everything. I was a bit of a Luddite. But then realised, no, you know, what it was that somebody said that it was about editing and digital editing, and then, you know, I was seeing like all the younger kids coming through who were just really great with computers and the technology, and I'm thinking, oh, I'm an old guy and I'm losing touch and everything. And somebody said to me, yeah, but they haven't got your experience. And when I looked in that way, I thought, well, if I can learn digitally, I know about editing, I know the ins and outs of it. They've got to learn that. They might know the technology, but they don't know how to work with that. And so once I approached that and moved in that direction, it started bit by bit to come back together. And eventually, what really pulled me back into play was the fact that the history and the documentation of the history wasn't talking about particularly this early 80s and what came before, and the black scene that was driving it, you know, forward and everything. And so I started a blog, it was a website called Electro Funk Roots, that documented that period, what led up to it, what came from it. And it was as a result of doing that people started to say, would you like to DJ at our nights? And then organically I did one, and that got me another gig, and bit by bit, and it built up. Yeah, and it's, what's really weird as well, year on year, it's still that kind of rolling ball organically still going, you know, at this point even. I keep asking, before I forget, keep asking like, when's it going to kind of plateau, you know, but it's still working in that direction, which is fantastic. I'm really, you know, really strange, but very glad, of course, you know, it's gone that way.
Fantastic. You mentioned digital editing and recording software and things like that.
Yeah.
One of the idiosyncrasies of your set is that you use a reel-to-reel tape machine.
Yeah.
Why do you do that? What's the advantage of it?
Well, basically, I started working with a reel-to-reel back in the day, and it was for radio mixes. I didn't use it in a club then. I used to put my mixes together on reel-to-reel. When I was working in studios, what I'd do, this is when I wasn't a DJ, I'd make tapes of just sounds and samples and effects and anything, a bit off the TV, and all these were separated on a tape. And what I'd do is I'd be making a track, and then I'd just sit back, chill out, and just play a tape of sounds over the top, and then go, oh, that sound works. Did it on a random basis, and then maybe threw it into a sample, or just did it as a one-take thing, and I used it in that sense. So when I came back to DJing, I was kind of stuck between, do I go back to vinyl, or do I go the CD route? I'd stopped collecting vinyl years before, so I had some of my stuff on vinyl, some on CD. And then the third option was to go the laptop route. But to balance that, I like the idea of like antiquated technology against modern technology.
Yeah.
And everything that I do, I always try to balance those two things together. I find that important. I knew what I didn't want to be when I came back, and it was like this Mr. Nostalgia, you know, this DJ from the past coming playing the old records in the same way, because there was no lifespan in that. People would have maybe come and see me, tipped me off the list and moved on. So I had to do something that was relevant to now. And so the idea of balancing these things up, so I liked bringing back and having that connection to the past.
Yeah.
And also, it's like, I'm not a musician or anything, that's like my instrument, that's what I'm used to. I mean, in theory, I could get a sampler and do something similar, but it wouldn't quite be the same.
Of course,
You know, it's playing it the way I do, feeling the machine the way that I do.
It's not a bad quality medium to be playing your records in as well.
Well, exactly. Well, as I say, I play the stuff off CD, and you know, it's there to pepper things up and just give it that little bit of difference that it's just my little identity on it.
It's a good USP, definitely. I'm really excited to see you play on that, because
Yeah.
I've never seen someone do that before.
People really like seeing it. It was funny when I first started coming out with it, they thought I was going to show a film or something. They thought it was some kind of, you know, film projection thing.
Yeah,
you know,
it's a funny old piece of kit, isn't it? It's funny.
I mean, like, yeah, exactly. When you look at something like that, and like some kids now don't even know what a turntable is or record. You know, so seeing a reel-to-reel with tape, and you know, it's an odd thing, but you know, it serves me so well, and it's become basically the symbol of what I do, really, in a sense.
It's fantastic. Like I said, I can't wait to see it. Well, just a couple more questions, and I'll let you get back to your DJing. What are you listening to at the moment? What's in your CD player or on your tape machine?
Well, I mean, I don't get a chance to kind of listen to much outside of what I'm playing. I'm always kind of looking for stuff to play, but again, Kermit comes into play. I mean, he did his gig here, so this is going to be fun. So, but he approached me a while ago with his Blind Arcade stuff, and he said, you know, I'd like you to get involved, and I was like, I just haven't got the time. I've got so much on. But when I heard it, it was like, yeah, you know, this is what I'm about. I want to work with, you know,
the one with the specials remix.
No, I mean, there's all sorts of kind of stuff from the past. I think he's the Four Seasons and stuff like that, you know. But it's really kind of commercial on one level, but it's still edgy. He's managed to, and so I'm going to kind of get involved. I'm also doing my own stuff, so I'm thinking more about my own music at the minute, and so, like, you know, my concentration is very much on what I'm doing, you know, as such. You know, there's bits and bobs that I hear here and there, you know. I mean, I hear a lot of stuff with my son, who's like 15, he keeps me kind of up to date, but he's more kind of rock based, he's in bands and stuff, and into that side of things. But yeah, you know, I'm like really excited about the idea of like working. I mean, it's taken me a long time. I kind of produced a couple of tracks last year, and they were the first time I produced anything since I come back to DJing. I just hadn't found the time. I'd heard myself saying it for the last 4 or 5 years. That this year.
Medium, or did you use tape?
No, it's all digital medium. I mean, it's pointless using tape now because for editing purposes, for example. You know, people say, do you edit on tape? And it's like, in those days, if I wanted to repeat a bar loop, I had to, you know, say if I wanted 16 bars the same loop, I had to record that 16 times, edit every bit, you know, whereas now you record it one time, you edit it once, and then you press 15 and boom, it's there, you know, so it's pointless really, you know, like kind of working it in that way, you know.
Fair enough. So do you think that the future of Greg Wilson music, you're going to do doing some more production, doing some more DJing?
Well, I think the DJing's always there now. I think I want to be involved in making music. That's, you know, my passion from before I was a DJ. I always loved music. I always loved records. You know, I used to follow the charts religiously. You know, and I look at what's happening now, and you know, the last 10 years has really, we've been in a situation whereby, you know, like the kind of chart's been dominated by talent shows, and we've lost that kind of, you know, this country, the riches of music that came and that we're accepting what's being given at this second in time, but people don't know any better, I suppose. And I think with the internet, although it's a fantastic thing because you can go and find all sorts of stuff, at the same time there's so much out there that I think people are dazed and confused by it. So it's trying to find my own channel within that and working with stuff, and hopefully, you know, people get into that and, you know, see where that takes it really.
Fantastic. Well, thanks a lot for your time. I'm really looking forward to hearing you play later.
Nice one, thanks.
Cheers.